Just acknowledging the President, Ms. King, and of course our moderator. Although Fiji and Sweden are quite different, but we also co-chaired the Oceans Conference that was held last year. So there are certain grounds of commonalities. I'll be very quick so we can generate a bit more discussion from the floor. But I think in respect of the first question, in order to be able to mobilize finance for climate action, I think it's very critical for the individual states to be able to first articulate what your actions are going to be, and secondly, to be able to cost it out. Because once you get that level of analysis and assessment and better clarity, then you'll be able to essentially attract, a whole plethora of financing opportunities. Just by way of example, Fiji used the World Bank to carry out what we call a climate vulnerability assessment. So they've costed it out. It'll cost approximately about $9.4 billion over the next 10 years to be able to build resilience in our infrastructure. Apart from that as a framework, then you can of course be able to put in place domestic resource mobilization. For example, in Fiji, we've started what we call an ECAL tax, which is Environment Climate Adaptation Levy. Essentially, if you stay at a hotel, you rent a car, you watch a movie, you drink at a pub that has a gross turnover more than $1.5 million, then you attract a 10% levy. And what we've done, we've put in place a specific law that all the funds raised from this particular levy must only go towards climate adaptation measures and also environment. So it cannot go into government consolidated fund. We also, as part of this, have now developed the idea that from our next budget cycle, which begins on the 1st of August, we'll take a small percentage out to be able to set up a trust fund that hopefully will attract, many interested parties to this, where we will set up a trust fund looking at what we call the relocation trust fund. Because of encroaching waters, we have something like 43 villages that are now under threat. They have to be moved to higher ground. And so this will be a specialized fund to be able to address not just necessarily relocation, but perhaps some adaptation measures to be able to stop the relocation. But if we do relocate, then we have to build in the holistic approach to, for example, sustainable livelihoods, new way of livelihoods that they need to develop. We have, of course, also worked with, and I think this is very important, to just getting back to the CVA, because we've done this now with the World Bank, and I encourage many countries that have not done their CVAs, Climate Vulnerability Assessment, to do so. It's very easy to replicate. And once you have that in place, then it gives you the ability to go out to the market. We did so last year. We worked very closely with the IFC and World Bank, and we developed the green bonds for Fiji. We're the first emerging market to actually issue green bonds. They are now listed on the London Stock Exchange. And it also, again, we have had third-party validation. Sustainalytics now validates the funds that are raised to ensure those funds go specifically only to climate adaptation and environmental measures. I think the last point I'd like to make, without saying too much on it, is that we need to be able to realize that you need to have a blended finance approach. Not everything can be done by one particular source of funding. We have, I can give you some examples later on where there's a particular water environment project, in particular access to water and sewage systems, improvement sewage systems, where we have a blended finance approach. We have GFC gave a grant, approximately $32 million. We have the Asian Development Bank that's funded part of the loan, and the Fijian government is putting in about $150 million raised through various revenue measures, a $400 million project spent over 7 years. But without that blended finance approach, we will not be able to do it alone. And I think that's very important to understand that. Very quickly, how will the Paris Rulebook contribute to it? Again, is highlighted by the minister who spoke before me, that we need to ensure that our NDCs are put in place, they are articulated well. It can also, the rulebook will help us to secure progress and, of course, re-engineer our budgets accordingly. Interestingly enough, the finance minister's climate action in Fiji, around about 2016, we very quickly realized that climate action or climate action matters could only be successful if we mainstreamed it. So Ministry of Foreign Affairs, in fact, had climate change sitting in it as a department. So we moved it across to Ministry of Economy, or equivalent of Ministry of Finance, which also included strategic planning. So now every single policy that's run out of Ministry of Economy through the budgetary process has climate change and climate action actually mainstream through the policy, which I think is very good to do that. So we are natural partners to the coalition that happened at the World Bank. Countries like Fiji, and there are many other countries here from the smaller states in particular, to be able to attract private finance actually, we do not necessarily have the economies of scale. And again, I would like to re-emphasize for many of the other smaller countries with a less carbon footprint, almost negligible, there's a huge focus on adaptation because we are more at the coalface of climate change. So, building seawalls, being able to build resilience into your roads, your bridges, your electricity, connectivity, etc. So it's not necessarily the flavor of the month in adaptation space. As we know, there's been a lot of struggle regarding adaptation. There's a lot more focus, in particular also private sector focus in the mitigation space, where new technologies, new innovations have come into that space. But again, we think there's opportunities there, in particular in the agricultural sector, where we could, where there's a threat to food security, where you have salination of your soils, where they no longer can plant food items. There's also, in terms of water tables being reduced. And of course, you have El Nino effects, you have landlocked countries, for example, in respect of the river systems not only being polluted, but also in respect of the water flows are diminishing. So we can, for example, if I can use the example of the Pacific, should be able to take regional approaches to have bankable projects. So, the land mass of many of the smaller countries isn't enough to, cater for the large solar farms that you have in other continental countries. So I think there needs to be some thought process around that to be able to attract some bankable projects and indeed to be able to attract private sector. We also need to have, as I highlighted, new technologies. We've recently also done a assessment where we're going to look at various ways in which we can adopt technology to meet these requirements. Reducing risk, of course, is climate insurance is very, very important. And again, as discussed in the World Bank last week in various forums, we discussed, Fiji is chairing the Small States Forum, the Minister Clark was also there and he contributed in one of the panels, is that we need to be able to find reinsurers offshore, because local insurance companies do not necessarily have the capacity nor the capital to be able to invest in that space. So again, we had a cyclone that wiped off 1/3 of the value of our GDP in 2016 within 24 hours. It was gone. So we do not have any insurance, not for any of the state-owned infrastructure, nor for many of the homes, about 40,000 homes, that weren't necessarily built up to a particular standard where private sector would in fact give insurance. So how do we actually bring them in? So the scope of products like parametric insurance needs to be further developed, and we're currently working with the World Bank on that. We need to look at aspects of crop insurance. So I think the idea would be to develop the synergies with the private sector for reinsurance, and a company like Swiss Re actually does come to mind. Again, in respect of whether it's construction, transportation, infrastructure, I can use Fiji as an example. We're looking at green transportation. We're looking at specifically, for example, green shipping. We have a lot of connectivities between the islands, and some of them can take 24 hours to travel to, some of them maybe 12 hours. So how are we, what sort of technology is being used in the vessels? What sort of, right from the cleaning detergents that's used on the ships to clean out the ships, what sort of damage it's causing to the environment? And of course, the type of fuel that's being used. We're also looking at land transportation as far as green transport is concerned. So I think there's a number of areas that we are able to attract private sector interest in that space. And we want to be able to ensure that we have a number of forward-looking initiatives. I'll give you an example. We have a national carrier, Fiji Airways. They've now made a pledge as part of our 1 million trees being planted a year, that every time a Fiji Airways plane lands somewhere in some airport in the world, they will plant a tree. And that project is actually working quite well. And we want to be able to urge other carriers, whether it's Qantas, Virgin, Air New Zealand flying into Fiji, they should also do the same. And we can, of course, replicate that wherever we land. We don't mind planting a tree in that country where we actually land our plane. So I think the point being, if we, as I mentioned about the blue economy, if we are going to invest in a blue economy, because the sequestration rate is very high in the blue economy space, the amount of carbon that's being soaked in by the blue economy around Fiji is in fact far more than what Fiji is actually emitting. So we are in fact helping other countries with their sequestration rate. So I think there needs to be what I would call a sort of borderless approach to many of these initiatives. And I'm sort of obviously preaching to the converted, that climate change obviously is a global phenomena, and we need to be able to address it from a global perspective. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.